I got the big fella back in the studio like I promised. He's not in the studio, but we're recording our partner podcast. A follow-up. We did the 89-day plan. I was talking about periodization. I was talking about the use of this kind of to refocus, reprioritize. Dad, you really like the 89-day plan, don't you?
Again, the periodization thing you jumped into is, again, it's a great time of the year. It's the middle of the year, and there's a lot of stuff going on, Olympics, Wimbledon. Again, they're all trying to peak for an amazing time in their world. But as the average person, hey, how do we just reset and start over? And the 89 days is very specific, and that's what I've used probably for my last 5 or 6 bodybuilding contests, and I use it still today regularly. I don't get as specific and not as dialed in, but it gives me a good roadmap. So again, if anybody wants to click on that and get that printout, and it gives you a little more specifics on what you discussed in your last podcast on periodization.
Yeah, so we'll share that plan. It's an 89-day workout plan, very specific, talking about the periodization, adding the rest with the work, with the eating, and all sprinkled in. As a follow-up, we have our spirulina chlorella back in stock. Thanks for hanging with there a couple days. Again, we're supposed to get in May, then June. It's middle of July. Just part of the supply chain right now. Again, spreading the love. Our podcast is growing. Thank you for everybody who shares this. If you haven't shared it and you like it, you think it brings value, just a reminder to share it if you can. There's the audio, there's the video. It's on the app. It's on all the podcast channels. Make sure to share that. And before we were getting started, you were talking about a little bit of a case study specifically to yourself. And you got a full panel of blood work, the same type of blood work that you recommend to your clients. Talk to the audience about the frustration you have with the process, but then also a little bit of an story about when your results came back.
Again, back to your periodization podcast, it's the middle of the year. I try to get my blood test once a year, and I get to know your numbers. So for those of you new to this, you go to our website, click on the download, and there's a know your numbers one-page handout. And it's all the basic stuff, but stuff that most of the time you have to ask for, you're not going to get, like homocysteine, highly sensitive C-reactive protein. You have to ask specifically for your GFR, which is a kidney function. And then obviously testosterone is not being tested enough, in my opinion, for both men and women. So again, it's an aging marker, it's a stress marker. And so if you go in there, and again, I had a great experience getting my blood drawn, but my doctor, and again, I have a great relationship with him. He'll do all the tests, but what I've received many times is people call in and say, my doctor won't test this. I had a woman the other day, she's very frustrated. And I said, firstly, you got to start asking better questions to your doctor and say, number one is, I'm looking for a partner. Again, you're the doctor, I'm the patient, but I want a team approach. And so I'm trying to be ahead of the game, and I want to be more preventative. And that's the conversation. And this is why I want these tests versus if you just come in there and I want these tests, they're going to many times give you pushback. So step number one is having that dialogue with your primary care doctor and say, hey, these are the tests I want because I want to get ahead of the game. Because many of these tests, there's no medications for them. And so I got my blood tests back, just received it this past week, and all the markers, didn't have any problem getting them. But on the other hand is many times you get the conversation on your cholesterol's too high. And I'm like, yeah, I want my cholesterol high, because the higher your cholesterol is in balance, the more you thrive, the longer we live. And so I had that conversation a little bit yesterday that my cholesterol is a little high. Yeah, I'm cha-ching. I want that. And goes with that is obviously testosterone, because cholesterol makes testosterone. So my point of this, just bringing it up, get your blood test, get all these tests, have better dialogue, and the Rest Eat Move book goes into the details, chapter 31. But you need to take more ownership in your health. Everybody does. And so we're here to help you in this journey. But if you don't know some of these numbers, how do you make changes and see what's working and not working? Anyway, that's what I want to touch on because I get these emails, you get them regularly, and they're getting pushback on some of these numbers. And the reality is you got to have better dialogue with your primary care
And
doctor.
just, I mean, just we like transparency. Share with the audience what your total cholesterol was at 66,
It was 237 in
and
my
that
email.
that's going to throw a red flag on health insurance or life insurance. It's gonna Your doctors aren't going to have conversation. Let me throw the opposite side. Let's just say your cholesterol was 150. What would the typical response be?
Fantastic. But if I got a 150, I'm like, whoa, what's going on here?
Yep. So just there's a nuance there. For whatever reason, it is what it is, but we just don't have enough of the full picture when it comes to cholesterol. And we're going to get into the heart and talk about cardio in a second here. But there's actually a lot of research, and that's what we've been talking about for years, that you want that cholesterol actually to be elevated and balanced because it's going to actually allow the body to thrive. It's one of the most important molecules in the body is cholesterol. It's essential for thriving, for life. And there's now a lot of research around if your cholesterol actually starts to get below 150, 130, it's a pretty red flag indication for other disease, specifically cancer. It's wild, and I'm just sharing this as just kind of to share the love of what's frustration out there. We can't be there with you. We can't convince every doctor the way to think, but if the doctor right now isn't going to talk to someone when their cholesterol is too low, and yet if the number is too high, and that's actually a good thing, they kind of browbeat you that you should go on a medication. So that's just the frustration. I'm a huge fan of if you struggle to find a doctor that will do these tests, there's so many different services where you can actually mail in your blood with your saliva and do some different things that I think is getting better and better and better. And they're much more progressive and have a lot more, I would say, cutting edge information with it.
And I think one last thing is having that conversation is like, one of my closest friends is he's searching for a cardiologist. Just have that dialogue right up front. Am I in the right room? Am I in the right room? I want to do the team thing. I want to do the right thing. And not most people are not coming in there with that conversation. The doctor's behalf is they're worried that the patient's not going to do what they're supposed to do. But if you come in right away and say, hey, this is what I'm looking for, I'm the patient, but bottom line, you're the customer. So that's why we want to have these conversations. But back to my cholesterol being 230, but my triglycerides were 74, and then my HDL is in the 70s. And then I look at my LDL is high because is in balance. And now the last thing I'll mention is they want that LDL to be very low. And the LDL is not going to be low if your cholesterol level is high. So it's all about the word balance. That's the key when we look at cholesterol.
So I kind of look at, say, again, because we're using you today as a story, but if I was going to compare you versus another 66-year-old, there's so much more information and data points that we need to look at. Fitness level, strength, muscular, hormones, sleep, other blood measurements. And I think we get so fixated on a number without looking right in front of us at some other data points. So it would be very evident to me when I look at, let's just say, somebody that's 66 with a cholesterol of 190, and then you look at these other data points, it would line up much easier than if you just look at the panels next to each other. Age, cholesterol, it tells you nothing, really. You need to look at the rest of the equation.
Yeah, and I think the other thing too, he mentioned that, wow, your testosterone level is quite high at close to 600. I'm like, I want to be higher than that. But anyway, that's exactly what you're saying. It's the big picture. What are we looking at? And as a customer, as a consumer, we have to take more ownership, and that's why we do these podcasts.
All right, we'll keep going down that because I think there's so much to explain and it can be complicated, it can be scary, it can be confusing. I think at the end of the day, all of us, including the doctors, are just trying to reduce our risk. I think that is the intention and they're coming from a good place, but doesn't always mean they're right. So you can have great intention and still not be giving the right advice for the specific person. So today let's dive
I
into.
think one last thing here that you mentioned, this is what everybody should take away. It's never one thing. It's the big picture. It's everything. It's your skin, it's your hair, it's everything, including your blood work. So again, that's the key I want everybody to understand. It's not one thing. It never will be. If you have
Well,
high blood pressure, you
I,
have other issues.
I think we should test all these Olympic athletes, and I think we would be shocked what their cholesterol is, what their testosterones are. I mean, and they are testing those things because we're trying to not do steroids and other performance enhancing drugs. That's a whole different conversation. But when you're these biomarkers are not necessarily designed to compare people that are thriving. They're really designed to catch disease. And so health, the definition is the absence of illness and disease. I hate that definition. I've talked about that before. That to me is like average. But if you're trying to be above average, we got to look at numbers from a thriving standpoint. It's in a whole different lens. So there are some people that we work with, some coaching clients that we have where we're trying to just get them back to baseline. And those numbers and those goals and those measurements are going to be a completely different set. But if you have no risk, no side effects, feel good, your weight is good, your fitness is good, you're sleeping, you don't have skin issues or digestive issues, those parameters move to thriving. It's the same thing that we're going to see in the Olympics. I'm trying to run. I'm not trying to run a 3:43 mile. It's not possible for me. And so if that's my only parameter, I'm not measuring the right thing. So that to me is it's great that you had those done and I think the next podcast maybe we'll go even deeper as you get these numbers back and we'll kind of share some of the information because I think it will help. Okay, let's go into cardio because I spent the 89-day plan, the periodization, really talking about strength training, scheduling, how I'm going to train. But I kind of do the same thing with cardio, which I'll get into. But I think one of the pieces, as you were discussing what we're going to talk about, is you truly believe most people don't fully understand cardio. They don't understand anaerobic or the difference between aerobic and anaerobic. With the Whoop and the Oura rings and the wearables, the heart rate variability is more popular than ever. We've heard of VO2 Max for many, many, many years. Fasted cardio is becoming so popular to talk about as intermittent fasting and different ways to shred fat and gain strength. And it goes on and on and on and on. So today we're going to talk about cardio. And the way that I look at cardio is it's a piece of the pie in your exercise and fitness and move routine. Sometimes it's over focused on. We know a lot of people that just over focus on cardio. And then for some people it's under focused and to me prevents them from peak thriving. So that's what we're going to talk about is cardio. And I'll start with this, especially through COVID. I always was very interested in the conversation you had that the first thing that happens as we age is we lose lung function. And as we get into cardio today and talk about lung function and the heart, why don't we start right there? How important is cardio for longevity and, as you like to say, aging well?
Well, I think there's two things to think about when you think of cardio. When I was the director of fitness at the Michigan Athletic Club, we did an expansion. And the number one reason we did that expansion of one of the largest health clubs in the world, we did not have enough cardio equipment to meet the demand. Because everybody at that point in time in the early 90s truly believed the best way to lose weight was doing more cardio, more treadmills, more step mills, the list went on. So I think that that's changed a little bit along the way where people are now looking at strength training. But if you really look at thriving and longevity and everything else, is number one is we want to have that cardiovascular system. A VO2 max, which we'll talk about in a minute, is one of the greatest predictors of longevity. So if you have a higher VO2 max, the average person, we're not talking about the elite runners we're going to see in the Olympics. We're talking about the average person. If you just did a VO2 max on them, it's one of the greatest predictors of longevity. Number two is as we get older, especially, muscle is a big deal. And so can you have muscle with good cardiovascular systems? And the answer is yes. So those are the two things I always work with my clients on is what is your cardiovascular fitness level? And number two, what type of strength and muscle do you have? And those two together will help you thrive and have better longevity.
Two of the best predictors for longevity are number one, VO2 max, and number two, do you have muscle? I think that's a good takeaway, kind of to sum that up. I'm going to go deeper. Why is VO2 max an indicator of longevity?
When you think of, let's just step back for a second. If you ask the question, what is cardio? I kind of put it in two buckets. And cardio means you're using your cardiovascular system, as you mentioned earlier, your heart, your lungs, your vessels, all the organs, the whole system's working. And one of the greatest things from doing any type of exercise, including cardio, is what it does for the mind. So we now know that if you looked at what's the benefit of cardio, it helps you have a better cardiovascular system. It helps hormonal balance. It helps your stress hormones, the mind, the body. It does all this stuff. So the benefits we could spend a lot of time on. So that's the big thing. But then you break it down a little bit deeper. And then aerobic exercise, when you think of truly aerobic exercise, oxygen meets the demand. So I can go for a walk and I can maintain that. And then anaerobic is where oxygen does not meet the demand. And so many of us have done this before. We've run to the bus, we've done whatever, and we stop, and the next thing we have to catch our breath. And that's what we're doing. We're replenishing the oxygen debt, it's called. So we're in debt with the oxygen. So aerobic exercise meets the demand, anaerobic does not meet the demand. And then there's everything in between. So when we watch the Olympics coming up, this will definitely be people they're trying to maintain that, but they're pushing it to the limit. And that's called anaerobic threshold, going to the weeds just a little bit deeper. And that's the key for a lot of these athletes. You're talking about running, you're trying to buffer your anaerobic threshold. You're trying to run that 5-minute mile. You constantly have to do that. You can't just go for a walk or an
5-minute mile. A 5-minute mile in the Olympics that will get lapped.
Yes,
You're
true.
gonna get lapped a couple times.
But that's just to break
So
down.
just
That's kind of a little bit different between the cardio.
breakdown, and let's just follow up with that original question though. So then, why does that matter to longevity?
Because you're thriving. You have a more capacity in your system to handle more and more things. So
Capacity. Back to that capacity word that we love. More capacity,
yes.
more range. So if you let's just say you were to get pneumonia, you
Yes.
have more of a range to fight off that
Correct.
illness, or
More
if
capacity.
you're more capacity. So that's why it's key, is because we're having more range. And you talk about this a lot. As your capacity shrinks, things can spiral quickly. So if you can't now go up a flight of stairs, now you don't go up a flight of stairs. And so everything starts to shrink. You go to one level of a house, you get a different car that you can get in and out of. And so all those things compound over time. And I think it's so easy in our modern world to not move our body. And so we sometimes take for granted that I didn't even realize my cardiovascular system was as weak. And I talked about that in the podcast last week. That's the area that I haven't been able to, in my opinion, be where I want to be, because I can't do the same level of cardio. Now, that part of that's an excuse, and because there's so many different ways to get cardio, but the cardio that I like, the things that I like to do, require using my hips, legs, knees, and the chain that really has been bothering me. Great. I love that summary. You talked about anaerobic threshold. There's also lactic acid threshold? What's just for the listener that cares, what's the difference?
When you speed things up too much, you start getting into more anaerobic, you start spilling things out over. And that's why you can't continue. And so what happens is you can't keep up the demand. And one of the things the body does naturally, it starts spilling out more lactic acid. And so now it's going to shut you down. You've lost that capacity. And so what you're doing when you do this more anaerobic training, you're buffering that lactic acid. You're allowing that you can go higher or harder and not having as much lactate spill over from the Krebs cycle. So that's the science of
Are they
training.
the are they the same thing, or is it just a nuanced terminology?
It's just a nuanced terminology. No, they're not exactly the same thing. But the body, when you think of exercise physiology, what is physiology? Exercise physiology is when you look at speeding things up so you can see things quicker. That's the science of what does an exercise physiologist do? They study how the body adapts to when it has under stress, movement, exercise. So that's really what you start seeing more and more is you start seeing these things. And so that's the science of training. Like when you develop cardiovascular, most people don't really think of that. They think of just losing some weight. I'm just going to go move my body more and lose some weight. And again, that's fine. But today's conversation, I wanted to jump into the weeds because I get these questions all the time about heart rate variability and heart rate range and heart rate and this and that. So that's kind of why I want to jump into that.
Yeah, interval training. So one last question that I'm interested, I guess I haven't thought about this. What's the maximum amount of time someone can be in an anaerobic state? I think about my 5 minute mile, that's pretty close to an anaerobic state. Is it 5 minutes? Is it a minute? Is it?
It all depends on the buffering capability back to capacity of the individual. And that's how they train. So if you looked at Wimbledon right now, you got Alcaraz and Djokovic and all these, they train specifically for that. So they're not in anaerobic, complete anaerobic, because you have to catch up. That's why when you see these long points, they're walking back slowly to the service line because they have to catch up. They can't continue that. The body's going to shut down very quickly. So they're always trying to buffer it, and that ceiling gets higher. So as that ceiling, that's the key is it all depends on the individual and what they're doing. Like if you look at MMA fighters or whatever they're doing, sprinters, that's why the 800 meters is such a difficult race because it's completely anaerobic. And that's
Yes.
okay. So how long did that take?
I think, yeah, we'd have to look that up. I think based on experience, would it be safe to say 5 minutes or less?
Oh, God, it wouldn't be that long.
You wouldn't be even that long. Yeah.
Because if you look
Yeah.
at these milers, they're not sprinting right from the beginning. If
It
they were
seems
sprinting
like,
from the beginning, like this is sprint as fast as you can, well, you're going to watch them fall apart. You see them fall apart now. These are the best athletes in the world. You see them fall apart in the 400, in the 800. So it doesn't last long. Pure. And here's what again. So I'm just jumping in the weeds real quickly. So if you do a VO2 max, and I've done this, hook you up to the gas. You're in a science. You're in a lab. Not saying we have to do that, but I'm just going to talk about the science for a second. A true VO2 max at the end, they just keep taking the treadmill. The incline keeps going up. They increase the speed. Rocky Four, Ivan Drago. That's what it looks like. Hook you all up. And they take them up. They start them out and they just slowly take them up. But a true VO2 max, your respiratory quotient hits 1.0. Nobody ever talks about this. And when you get up to 1.0, you are completely in complete full anaerobic. You are not going to last much longer. But that tells you are completely anaerobic. And guess what fuel is being used in complete anaerobic is carbohydrates.
carbs.
And so when you do not have enough carbs in your body, your respiratory quotient, you can't get up that high. And we used to see that people would be on the treadmill and they were like, on a 1 to 10 scale, how hard is this? At the 10, I can't go any further. We look at the respiratory quotient, it was 0.7. They're not even sniffing pure anaerobic training, but they felt like it was too hard. And then you got the beasts, like my buddy Dan Bender. He's on there, and next thing, Dr. Husner's going, wow, this cat's at 1.0.
I
This
can't
guy's
I can't
coughing
put
up
the
the
cliff any
lung.
higher.
Yeah. So anyway,
Yeah, I always found it interesting about Lance Armstrong. He actually didn't have the highest VO2 max in comparison to other cyclists. I could be wrong, but I think it was like the higher end of average. But his anaerobic lactic acid threshold was the highest.
well, and the other thing too is,
He could handle complete all out longer than anyone else.
and there's so many variables because again, VO2 max is a great predictor of how fast you can run and who's going to win. But there's so many other variables, like we talked about cholesterol today. And one of that variables is the mental aspect of it. How gritty, how tough are these people on top of the anaerobic type training? So there's so many other variables but that's a great indicator of where people are going to lie in that. I want to
Yeah, and
touch
if you want to get motivated, the guy behind me, Steve Prefontaine, that's how he used to run. Is he used to go out as fast as possible and be a front runner, which nowadays no miler or 3 mile ever goes to the front because of the aerodynamics and all that stuff. But that was his philosophy: is I'm gonna out grit you. He
it.
wasn't the
This,
fastest.
this is the kind of this is the strategy you're going to see in some of these races coming up in the Olympics because some of them want to do that. They want to drag you into the deep end, and they're going to try to get you. They might, and some of them have a strategy. They're going to go out very quickly, and they're going to try to get rid of most of the field. So this is all, and again, these are the best athletes in the world. But I want to touch base on a couple of things when we talked about this earlier about if you said, I got this in my book here, but the science of cardio. I just want to touch base because I had a great conversation with a couple of my clients a month or so ago, and they had heart issues, but nobody's ever talking about this. So the first thing I was talking about is what is cardiac output? So the average listener out there today, if I ask you a question, what is cardiac output? They're not quite sure. And it's really a simple equation. So cardiac output equals heart rate times stroke volume. And so hang with us just for a second here. And stroke volume means the strength of the contraction of the heart. So again, I'll be touching 67 here in a couple months. On the average, as the average person, their heart rate goes up and their blood pressure goes up as they age. Why is that? Because they lose the strength of the stroke volume, the contraction. And on top of that, we have this thing called ejection fraction. You've never heard this before. If you have heard it, ejection fraction means if you had a balloon full of blood and you squeezed all that blood out of that balloon, that would be 100% ejection fraction. So for most of us right now, we have a very high ejection fraction, 80, 90, 95%. But as we age, we lose the strength of the heart, which is a stroke volume, which leads to a less ejection fraction. And that's how most of us will die if we're not hit by a bus at the end of our life. We have this thing called congestive heart failure. So I had a gentleman that had this congestive heart failure. I wanted him to understand how the heart works. Cardiac output equals heart rate times stroke volume. So if you're doing all this cardio and your heart rate starts to get better, lower, that means you have a higher stroke volume and a better ejection fraction. Wow, that's a great training effect. And so as we age, one of the greatest indicators of how you're aging and your fitness level is a low resting heart rate.
So how do you measure stroke volume?
Again, you can measure that into a lab, but really quickly is your heart rate goes down. And if your heart rate goes down, that means you're going to have a high stroke volume. So again, you can test these things in a lab, but the only person that gets them tested is the people that have heart problems. That's where I get it. They're coming to
Well,
me and
it's
they're
like
like having heart issues, and I'm like, "What's your stroke volume? What's such, and what's your ejection fraction, such?" And they're like, "How'd you know that?" I'm like, "Well, that's why you're here." When 82, that's why we have your resting heart rate's at 82. That's why you have a low stroke volume and a low ejection fraction.
Yeah,
So
I
that's
think
one of the huge benefits of doing cardio is you're trying to maintain that strength, that stroke volume, and that ejection fraction. And that
now
will
it
go up in a lower heart rate.
now is it true that if we just focused on aerobic steady state, it has less of a training effect long term?
Yeah. So again, that's why we do strength training, because strength training, most strength training is going to be anaerobic training. Or, and again, I used to do this with my clients. Hey, rate your cardiovascular fitness level on a 1 to 10 scale. Oh, I do the track every day. I walk, I bike, I do this, that. I'm about a 7, 8, 9, whatever. And then I would have them do 3 flights of stairs, up, down, up, down, up, down. They rest for 15 seconds, up, down, up, down. I do that 3 times. They're dying. They're like, wow, I spend 45 minutes to an hour doing cardio every day. You have no anaerobic conditioning. So again, back to anaerobic's going to help that stroke volume. Anaerobic's going to help the ejection fraction. That anaerobic's going to buffer your now my capacity is greater. So if I water skied yesterday and I went down and back and we had to pick up the ski and whatever because I don't like to get up on one ski anymore because I don't want to tweak my hamstring. But I dropped the ski and it's way over on the other side of the lake. I kept thinking, wow, I'm doing some anaerobic training right now because I'm out of gas.
Don't get too confident. I saw what's his name?
Banana
The barefoot
George.
nine Banana George, 90 years old, still barefoot skiing. So yeah, you're doing pretty good, but
I'm not,
Banana's out there
I'm
on.
not Banana George for sure.
One
Yeah.
thing that I want to clarify there as we kind of slowly wrap up into the conclusion of the cardio is what's the takeaway there? You talked about what I see in people my age. I'm 38, definitely a year age range where we get comfortable doing not the bare minimum, but what we're comfortable doing. And then then we're not comfortable doing what we used to be comfortable
Yeah, so
doing.
let's back up for a second. So number one, cardiac output is heart rate times stroke volume. If your heart rate generally is lower, you're going to have a higher stroke volume. So then the question is, what is your resting heart rate? Everybody needs to know that number. If my stress levels are too high, we'll talk about heart rate variability in just a second. But real quickly is you want to have a low resting heart rate. The average resting heart rate in the United States today is about 74. I tell all my clients I want them under 55. So if they come to me and they're at 74, the goal is to get them under 70. Probably never going to get to 55, but somewhere in there. But just think about the average in the United States. So the goal is number one, we have to do some cardiovascular conditioning. Could be the mini trampoline, could be hiking, walking, calisthenics, playing, whatever it is. We want to get that lower heart so we have greater capacity. And number two is, so again, where your currently resting heart rate is, that's a great indicator. You're talking about periodization. Let's work on that. That's the goal. If you said, "Hey, Matt, my resting heart rate is at 65," if I was training, I'd say, let's really work on getting that under 60. And that will happen with some anaerobic type training, some type of conditioning. And then from there, we look at heart rate range. And heart rate range is you take your max heart rate minus your resting heart rate, that's your range. So just a simple equation is 220 minus your age. Again, it's not super accurate, but it's accurate enough. So
To
let's
give it
just
your
say you're 40, 220 minus 40, your max heart rate, give or take, is close to 180. And if your resting heart rate is 60, you have a heart rate range of 120. And that's another thing I would work with my clients is I would say they go, how do you get a maximum heart rate? We knew 220 minus your age, where I can have you run up this hill as fast as you can, and we'll start getting there. But again, it just gives you some range. But that's the goal. And then number two is how fast you recover. That's the capacity. That's what we're seeing in tennis. That's what we're going to see in the Olympics. Is how fast can you go from your max level to back to almost your resting level? Not quite, but that's the range. So that's heart rate range. So then that
so
leads
let
into variability.
yeah, so let's end with heart rate variability as has become so common. The Oura ring, the Whoop, people are so fixated on this number, which I think is good and bad. But heart rate variability, let's discuss that.
So again, heart rate variability for everybody has been around forever. It started in the Soviet Union. and they really started looking at athletes, and it's even more precise, and you can measure it. But the most accurate way to measure it is with a chest strap, like a polar strap. But the rings and the watches, and they do a good job, but the most accurate is going to be a chest strap, or if you're doing an EKG. So that's the key here. So Brady, go on out. Out.
Brady's joining the
Shut the door,
podcast.
please. Shut the door, please. So Brady just got on our podcast. That's my 5-year-old grandson. So back to heart rate variability. So it's been around a long time, but they're measuring performance. They're measuring training. And if your heart rate variability, which is in milliseconds, what heart rate variability is the space between the beats. So if I have a resting heart rate of 60, you would think that you would have 1 second between each heartbeat, but that's not necessarily the case. It's in milliseconds. Some might be shorter, some might be longer, but let's make this really simple today. What heart rate variability is measured in milliseconds, and it's basically a range between 20, approximately, could be lower, up to 200. The higher, the better. So now we get into a little bit more detail on the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. Now we're getting into stress. So if you have generally a lower heart rate variability, closer to the 20, the 30, right in that range, 15, that means you don't have a lot of space. It's lower variability. And what we see this, I'm going to give you just a couple things here. Generally, if somebody's not healthy, diabetes, whatever it might be, heart issues, they will have an extremely low heart rate variability. And reason being is they have a higher resting heart rate normally. So you don't have enough space between the notes. There's not enough space. Somebody has a lower heart rate, generally will have a higher heart rate variability. But what the athletes started looking at is that if I'm overtraining somebody, the sympathetic nervous system makes the heart rate go up, my heart rate variability starts to fall. And so instead of doing a hard workout today, I look at the heart rate variability and it's a little bit lower than it normally should be for me. Again, it's very specific to you. And so that's where they started coming in, instead of having the same training over and over and over. And that's what they're doing now with the athletes. Maybe needs to be a lighter day, or maybe your heart rate variability is really good today. We can go after it. And so when you're sliding in the Olympics or into Wimbledon, whatever it might be, this is a great indicator that I'm back to your periodization. I'm not overtraining. I'm not undertraining. I'm training just right. The porridge is just right. And that's what heart rate variability is. So if you have a low heart rate variability, one of the greatest things you can do is start changing your lifestyle. Take a look at your sleep, your stress levels, what you're eating, what you're not eating. Are you overtraining? I have a couple of people in my world right now. They're really good shape. They're overtraining. 30,000 steps a day, low resting, low heart rate variability. Wait a minute. Where's your recovery days? Bring some recovery days in, the heart rate variability will go up. So again, it's a little bit more specific, but it's the space between the notes. And that's where we want. We want to have a high heart rate variability. And as we age, it's very age specific. But again, back to the stroke volume and the ejection fraction, this heart rate variability, as you get people that are more senior level and more fit, you're going to see higher heart rate variabilities. It's just more specific.
No, I think there's some gold in this. I think we'll record our next podcast and we'll kind of do a part 2 of this, because once we start using words ejection fraction, now you got such a great way to have conversations around dinner. You got so many cool things you can talk about with your friends: ejection fraction, respiratory quotient. But I think this all matters, as we sometimes make things too simple and we throw an Oura ring on, or we throw a Whoop on, and we just kind of trust that the numbers are telling us what we need to do, versus sometimes there's some nuances, and I'd always hedge towards listening to the body. I don't need a Whoop or an Oura ring to tell me I'm overtraining. You can kind of feel it. You can feel the anxiousness or the stress or the tension.
Again, where you're going with this is gold, because again, I have clients come in, their strains are, that was a great workout. Oh, well, that's probably not what you needed. We need to have a little bit less of that. or some of you need a little bit more of that. And when I used to
Right.
do bodybuilding contests and I would overtrain, I didn't have heart rate variability back then. I knew about it, but I would just look at my heart rate. If my heart rate started to climb, I was probably overtraining, not getting enough sleep, not enough rest. So again, these are just we're just diving into the weeds a little bit deeper, and
Yin
then
and yang.
why you need carbohydrates to have a higher capacity. So anyway, I just want to jump in the weeds, but you're right. I think we should do another level of this, but because there's so much to it and there's so much questions about it.
So here's my takeaway, and then we'll do part two. Number one is now everybody knows what ejection fraction is. I'm going to try to use that word a lot this week with my friends. But the big takeaway is the number one prediction of longevity, aging well, is your cardio level, or VO2 max if you want to get specific. And then there's other predictions, and they go hand in hand with strength training, like you said. But I think the takeaway is, if you're listening, is we have to be aware of this, because once our range shrinks, it's compound interest in the wrong direction. I can't do the flight of stairs, so I don't do the flight of stairs. Next thing you can't walk in a straight path before you have to sit down. Or maybe you used to run, in my case, and your body and your mobility and flexibility and fascia, all those things are not in lockstep where you want to be. I think always looking at your cardio is a great first step. And the takeaway that you said is, you should all know your resting heart rate. And if you know your resting heart rate, it's going to give you kind of a first clue on what your cardiovascular system is, or fitness is. And I think as we go into part two, we're going to go in more of the practical side, as we talked about the science and some of these numbers and what they all mean. So follow up part two coming next week on how to improve cardio, and really what are the practical things that we all should be doing. Any final takeaways?
No, I think it's good. I think, again, it brings me back to my days and when I was in graduate school. But I think more and more, as our society, we just want to have some basic things to know how we're doing and wake us up. And again, as you mentioned, resting heart rate's a great indicator. And we talk about this, the big three, and this is on our Know Your Numbers. How many breaths do you take per minute? Back to cardio. What's your resting blood pressure? And what's your resting heart rate? If those those big three are in line, probably you're going to be pretty darn good.
So I'm gonna end with this last thing, because I think this is the most fascinating, especially where we are from a nutrition, from social media, all this noise. I think sometimes we get over inundated with education and information. It's truly not possible to have your peak anaerobic output when you don't have the fuel of carbohydrates. You were talking about respiratory quotient. And I think that's such an amazing point, that sometimes we sacrifice our health, our fitness, our peak performance for the short term, how do we look? And that's a choice. There's a lot of bodybuilders that probably don't care about their respiratory quotient, right? It's more about how cut can they be. But I think for longevity, for aging well, for peak performance, again, we can't cut out a macronutrient. It's right there in the science. It has been longer than any of us have been talking about it. But I really found this fascinating, and we'll follow up with part two. Again, everybody share the podcast if you get any value. We want to bring you more. We want to bring you better ones. And with your support, that makes it possible. So enjoy the lake. Go tell Brady he was on his first podcast, and we'll see you again next time.